Boss fights have always been some of the coolest parts of any video game, acting as milestones for progression, a rite of passage you have to go through in order to get to the next part of the experience. But there are of course different types of boss fight. The first 4 games in the Final Fantasy series had 2 distinct types. There were story-based boss fights that were mandatory for progression, and optional boss fights that were perhaps a bit more challenging but offered suitable rewards as compensation. The developers felt there was something missing though, and upon the release of Final Fantasy V in 1992, Square decided to add a third type of boss, the Super Boss. These would be designed to offer something beyond the core experience. A test for players who wanted to max out their characters, obtain the best gear, and then yearn for a challenge that would be equal to their beefed up party. And over the years, with each new iteration of the franchise, super bosses have continued to be added in their droves. They stand true to the original ambition, and some of whom, like the weapons in Final Fantasy VII, have gone on to be iterated upon with future releases. At this point there are quite a lot of them, but there are of course some that are more challenging than others, and in today's video we're going to be running through the toughest super bosses that have appeared within the main numbered Final Fantasy games. As with our previous lists though, we will only be covering one super boss per game, and to set expectations, additional content found within European versions and MMO expansions is fair game. But in general, we won't be delving into bosses that were added with subsequent iterations of games, like Chronodia in the 20th anniversary edition of Final Fantasy I, or the Judge Magisters who were added in Final Fantasy XII, the International Zodiac Job System. So anyway, with that disclaimer out of the way, my name is Daryl, and these are 7 super bosses that unless you were incredibly well prepared for or just damn lucky, you probably didn't beat first time around. Starting with Omega Weapon in Final Fantasy VIII. Following the introduction of the weapons as super bosses in Final Fantasy VII, the team working on Final Fantasy VIII decided to pay tribute to what was largely their own work by introducing 2 new weapons called Ultima and Omega. Ultima was found in the Deep Sea Research Center and offered up a decent challenge once you reached the depths. But Omega, who lay in wait within Ultima Seer's castle, took things to the next level, with punishing attacks that were unlike anything else seen in the game. Those who wanted to test themselves first had to solve a mini puzzle that involved the bell outside the art gallery. Upon ringing the bell, Omega Weapon would appear at the chapel within the castle, and by switching teams it would be possible to approach Omega Weapon before the timer ran down. Now the fight itself could be pretty intense. Omega Weapon has 1,161,000 hit points and can inflict some serious pain due to his rather expansive array of attacks. But Omega Weapon does have one weakness, its predictable nature. Outside of its standard attacks, Omega Weapon cycles through a predetermined set of moves that are designed to be extremely awkward. But if you know what's coming, it does take the edge off slightly. For example, prior to Omega Weapon's 3 strongest attacks, Megiddo Flame, Terror Break and Light Pillar, it always performs a non-elemental AoE attack that is designed to weaken the party in preparation for the next step. Megiddo Flame, for example, does 9,998 damage, so unless you heal up following Meteor, you will most likely be seeing a game over screen. Likewise, Terror Break, which does 16 hits of at least 4,000 damage each spread across the entire party, is the follow-up move to Gravijar, which reduces your hit points by 75%. Again, if you don't heal up and also don't have either the Protect or Defend command utilised, you will be seeing a game over. It's particularly harsh if you come unprepared, and one wrong move can easily signal the end for your team, but there are some good antidotes. Megalixirs, for example, are extremely useful for recovering before the 3 aforementioned attacks, assuming you have enough people still alive to make them useful. You can acquire a good stock of Megalixirs naturally as you progress through the game, but if you're in a pinch, you can just refine the Bahamut card to give you 100 of them. Likewise, if you want to take the pressure off a little, you can also choose to use Hero Drinks or Holy Wars. These items make a character or the entire party invincible for a short period of time. You can obtain 10 Holy Wars by refining the Gilgamesh card, which should be enough to see you through the entire battle. Now if you are successful, you are granted with the Proof of Omega, a key item that prior to the advent of trophies and achievements allowed you to show off the accomplishment to your friends. In addition, you also gained the 3 stars item, which allowed Eden to perform a more powerful version of the Expend ability. Okay, so next up we have Absolute Virtue in Final Fantasy XI. This boss was added into Final Fantasy XI along with the Nemoria Notorious Monster system back in 2005 as part of an update to Chains of Promathia, and at the time the fight was tough as nails. But that's assuming you could even get to the point of being able to actually fight against Absolute Virtue, as you'd have to navigate through the minefield of defeating the various jailers and hoping they dropped the necessary triggers. Let's say you did manage to get there though, well then you'd have the chance to square off against probably the most difficult boss in the history of the Final Fantasy franchise, and perhaps gaming in general, well at least until it was eventually patched to make defeating it at least feasible. What made Absolute Virtue so challenging in its initial incarnation was just the sheer volume of things it could call upon. Using Dragoon as its base job, Absolute Virtue was able to use abilities related to that job, but it could also use 2-hour special abilities from all the other jobs too, such as Benediction, which is the White Mage's special job ability that is used to restore a significant amount of HP. On top of all of this, Absolute Virtue also had a rather hefty auto regen, and when its HP reduced by certain amounts, it would get progressively stronger. Needless to say, when you combined all of these parts together, it made for a very tough fight, and there were numerous reports of Link Shells spending huge sessions, often lasting days, where they were engaged consistently in the same fight, attempting to figure out strategies for defeating the boss legitimately, but it was all to no avail. People did though figure out how to defeat it by using exploits, but to rub salt in the wound, whenever anyone did find an exploit, the developers would release a patch that made the strategy obsolete, and the players who had used the exploit would be punished. 3 years after Absolute Virtue was added into the game, the developers decided to release a tutorial to give hints around how players could defeat it, but as a further irony, they released a patch not too long after the release of the video that stopped people from even being able to use the strategies that they had promoted. As you might expect, all of this led to lots of ire amongst the fans, and this eventually came to a head when the media got hold of just how ridiculous boss fights were in Final Fantasy XI. Sage Sundi, the global online producer and lead game master for Final Fantasy XI, made the claim that Absolute Virtue should take approximately 18 hours to defeat, and this statement raised question marks around the ethics of what Square Enix were actually doing. They actively put out messages saying that people should take breaks and that players should never allow Final Fantasy XI to interfere with school, work, families, or physical health. But they were expecting players to actively engage in a fight that should take approximately 18 hours. When reports then came out about people vomiting and passing out while attempting to defeat another notorious monster called Pandemonium Warden, Square Enix were forced to enact changes, and they made both bosses less ambiguous to defeat, while also reducing their overall strength and imposing a strict 2-hour time limit. And with the game's level cap also being increased from 75 to 90, the battle was also made much more achievable. Third on our list, we have Yzmat from Final Fantasy XII. With Yasumi Matsuno having to leave his role as the director of Final Fantasy XII due to poor health, the development team decided to pay tribute to their former leader, and to do so, they created a hunt called Farewell to a Legend, where you would need to defeat the ultimate elite mark called Yzmat. To gain access to this hunt, you needed to have defeated every single rank 7 mark with the exception of the Shadow Seer, but you also needed to have defeated the Hellworm, a rather troublesome optional boss that acted as something of an audition for what was about to come with Yzmat. And once all this was done, you can head to the Colosseum in the Ridorana Cataract to square off against this rather large, elaborately designed super boss. Now, much like our last boss on this list, what makes Yzmat so challenging is the endurance required to win the day, as Yzmat has over 50 million hit points, 50,112,254 hit points to be precise. This is rather a lot considering the damage cap is 9,999 in the original version of Final Fantasy XII, and it gets even worse, as once Yzmat has been reduced to less than 50% of its hit points, all attacks are capped at 6,999 damage instead. It's therefore estimated that this battle should take a couple of hours to finish, but the developers did at least put in the ability for you to leave, take a break and restock before coming back to pick up on the fight where you left off, assuming that Yzmat didn't manage to cast regen before you left. In terms of the battle itself, well, Yzmat's Rake ability has a 5% chance of inflicting instant death on every hit, and the lower its health, the more combo attacks it will perform with this move, reaching 12 combos when it's in its final stage. Alongside this, it has a complementary move called Death Strike, which also casts instant death, although this is somewhat mitigated by using Shell. Basically, Yzmat is going to kill your party members during this fight, a lot, and it's all about how you deal with that, keep it manageable and keep up the pressure despite the intensity increasing as the fight reaches its climax. Interestingly enough, although this fight can take hours, in the Final Fantasy XII Ultimania Omega guidebook, the development team actually posted their own personal strategy and setup where they show that you can defeat Yzmat in just 50 minutes. I'd recommend looking this up if you're interested in beating Yzmat as it appeared in the original game, as in the Zodiac Age, Yzmat is now much easier to defeat. Alright, so fourth on our list is Ozma from Final Fantasy IX. Compared to the other iterations in the Final Fantasy franchise, Final Fantasy IX was rather unique in the fact that its difficulty wasn't all about big numbers. Whereas many of the other final bosses or super bosses like the aforementioned Omega Weapon and Yzmat had hit points that were well in the millions, the boss with the most hit points in Final Fantasy IX was actually Quail, who only had 65,535. Ozma, arguably the most taxing and troublesome boss in the game, only has 55,535 hit points, which, if you're doing 9,999 damage per attack, thanks to abilities like Zidane's Thievery and Freya's Dragon Crest, would mean you can technically win this fight in 6 turns. If it were only that simple. Anyway, to gain access to Ozma, you need to play Chocobo Hot and Cold to the point where you've gained enough Chocographs for Choco to learn the Sky ability, which then gives you access to the Chocobo's Air Garden, and within the Air Garden there's a place called the Eidolon Cave, which is where Ozma resides. Now, due to Ozma's low health, this fight is all about preparation, as Ozma is rather astute and will change its behaviour in the fight quite considerably depending on what you present with your party setup. For example, if you have your party set up to absorb or nullify elemental attacks or status effects, Ozma won't waste turns casting those spells. This then makes the fight actually harder as it increases the probability that Ozma will use attacks like Meteor, its devastating magic attack that can cause instant game over if you're unlucky. And that's because Ozma's Meteor is similar to the main Meteor spell in the fact that it does a random amount of damage, but unlike the standard version, it never misses, and there's a very real chance it will deal 9,999 damage to the entire party. Outside of this horrible spell, Ozma also has the unfair advantage of having a modified ATB system applied to it. When its turn is charging, any action that's performed by the party will cause Ozma to instantly receive a turn, making it extremely difficult to have more than one turn in a row before Ozma performs a move of its own. The trick is to therefore hold off performing your actions until Ozma is in the middle of performing one of its own. But even still, Ozma can still perform counterattacks, and one of its counters is to cast Curagar on itself. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how when looking at this technically, you think it would be a quick fight, but with the way Ozma was configured, it's just not that simple, and despite only having 55,000 hit points, this fight can still last well over 10 minutes on a successful run. It's worth it though, because if you can outfox Ozma and defeat it, not only do you gain a significant amount of pride, but you also gain a pumice, which allows you to summon Arc. Our next super boss is Mohammed Prime Ultimate in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, when we pulled together our previous video about the hardest ultimate weapons to obtain, there was some consternation about us stating that the Weapons Refrain Ultimate was more difficult than the Unending Coil of Bahamut. So for this video, we're mixing things up and are giving the first ultimate raid introduced in Final Fantasy XIV its due, because it's hard as nails and completing it is still an incredible feat due to the presence of Mohammed Prime. This raid was introduced with patch 4.11 of Stormblood, and to be able to tackle it, players must have completed the Deltascape version 4.0 Savage raid, where you'll square off against Exdeath and Neo Exdeath. Upon completing this, you can then speak to the Wandering Minstrel in Kugane to activate the ultimate raid against Mohammed Prime. This battle is split into 5 distinct phases, and as you'd expect, they get progressively harder. It starts with individual fights against Twintania and Nail Deostanis before Mohammed Prime rears its ugly head in Phase 3, at which point things start to get rather serious. During this phase, Mohammed Prime will cast Giga Flare multiple times, and following one of these times it will use Grand Octet, which summons 5 additional dragons to rain down some serious pain. Now, this fight is tough enough as it is, but if Bahamut's health isn't below 60% following the completion of Grand Octet, then the fight is essentially lost already, as the final phase, Golden Bahamut, will deal far too much damage to make victory feasible. Making sure you have a well-oiled team is therefore crucial for ensuring success. In terms of how difficult this fight actually is, well, we can look at the frequency of how often it's being beaten. Since the 8th of September 2018, the Unending Coil of Bahamut has only had 74 complete runs uploaded to FF logs. By contrast, Weapons Refrain has had 530. That's a ratio of over 7 to 1. Now you could point out that the Unending Coil of Bahamut was put live 8 months earlier than Weapons Refrain, so there would be naturally less completions taking place now, but I'd still argue that you wouldn't expect the swing to be quite so extreme. Nonetheless, I don't think there are too many people who can say they've squared off against Mohammed Prime and beat it on the first try. Our penultimate super boss on this list is Omega from Final Fantasy V, who, as mentioned during the introduction, was one of the first super bosses in the franchise, appearing alongside Shinryu. Now, it has long been debated as to which of these two is actually harder, but for this list we've decided to go with Omega, and that's down to the strategies you can employ to achieve victory. And by that, I mean that there are strategies you can use against Shinryu that mean you can win at a much lower level than against Omega. They just take some time to set up. Anyway, so Omega can be found inside the interdimensional rift, wandering around the map directly outside of a save point, and you will want to be prepared for even thinking about engaging due to how punishing Omega's moveset can be. For starters, any attack that deals damage will be countered with 2 moves from Omega. The first can be either Rocket Punch, which inflicts the confused status and has a 66% chance of happening, or Mustard Bomb, which instantly kills the character. The second will either be Rocket Punch again with a 66% chance of happening, or Encircle, which permanently removes a character from the battlefield for the rest of the fight. And that's before we even get onto Omega's regular moveset, which includes the search function, leading all counterattacks to focus on one character as well as Omega's next actual turn. If you do go in with a good strategy though, and get lucky with the counters, then this fight can actually be pretty quick. But that doesn't make it any less difficult, and due to how Omega reacts to everything you do, there's always a chance that it just won't be your time to win, no matter how much preparation you think you've done. The somewhat ironic thing is that even though Omega is very tough, the developers obviously decided he wasn't tough enough and introduced Omega Mark II for later versions of this game. Okay, so last but not least, we have Pennants from Final Fantasy X. Unlike the other offline super bosses featured in this list, Pennants did not appear in the original version of Final Fantasy X that released in Japan or North America. However, the technicality here is that due to a rather lengthy localization process, Pennants did appear in the European version of the game when it released in May 2002, as they chose to localize Final Fantasy X International instead of the original game. The decision also meant that the European version had the Dark Aeons, much tougher versions of the standard Aeons from the main game, and these would act as precursors to the fight against Pennants. Indeed, you would need to actually defeat all of them before the game's super boss would appear above the Calmlands. Now, I will preface all of this by saying you can beat Pennants by using Yojimbo Zanmato, but if you're a purist or you just don't have the money, then you're in for one hell of a fight, as Pennants can cause some serious pain if you don't manage the situation. Clocking in with 12 million hit points and 2 arms that act independently and have 500,000 hit points each, it means Pennants has a lot of staying power, especially as its right arm can also heal for 100,000 per turn. The other rather troublesome aspect is Judgment Day, Pennants' ultimate attack that it will perform after being hit for damage 19 times, assuming both of its arms are still active. It will deal 99,999 points of damage, instantly killing the entire party. Auto life does still work, but you're in the hands of the gods as to whether the party is strong enough to survive for much longer afterwards. The main strategy therefore focuses on diminishing the impact of the arms, and if executed correctly, they should never get a turn. It's still no walk in the park though, as Pennants can still use Obliterate to deal up to 23,000 points of damage to the entire party. In its second form, Pennants also starts to use Immolation, which if not kept in check will quickly pick off party members due to its armor break status. Needless to say, defeating Pennants requires a lot of patience and concentration, but you'll get a great deal of satisfaction if you manage to achieve it. And with that, my list has come to a conclusion. So yeah, they were 7 incredibly hard super bosses from the main series games that I'm pretty sure you won't have beaten first time around. Well, unless you did an absolute ton of planning beforehand and probably got a bit lucky. Either way, are you in agreement, or are there other super bosses that you feel that I've missed out on that are perhaps harder? As always, let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, if you'd love to join our growing community, make sure you check out our Discord server. There's a link in the description below. Why not also consider supporting us on Patreon? You get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to support us in the creation of these videos, and we will reward you by, amongst other things, putting your name at the end of videos like these guys you're seeing right now. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I will see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.